Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We will be learning today, Emir Tzah Hashem, Daf Kuf Chav Daled Amud Beis. We're continuing to learn Hilchas Yom Tov, and today we begin here on Kuf Chav Daled Amud Beis with Siman Taf Kuf Ches, Devarim Ha'asurim B'Yom Tov Lahachanas Tzli. Things that are forbidden, that are prohibited on Yom Tov, things that you would do in preparation of roasting something. Ubai beis seifim, and here we have two seifim. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Aleph, Ein malabnin es ha'avonim. Literally, this means you're not allowed to heat up stones until the point where they are glowing. Malabnin means to cause them to turn white, which in this context means that they're glowing from heat. You're not allowed to be malabain stones, litzlois, to roast le'efais alehem, in order to use them as a surface to roast on or to bake on, mipnei shemachasman. The reason you're not allowed to do this is a concept that we already discussed in previous days, that there is a concept of tikkun moneh, of makeh b'patish. If you're doing something that finishes off a keli, or it somehow strengthens and improves a keli, this is a malacha of tikkun moneh, which comes from makeh b'patish, and you're not allowed to do those things on Yom Tov. Now, the Mechaber wrote, Ein malabden es ha'avonim. That's the text that we have over here in our print, and that would mean that we're discussing stones. But let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph, where the Chavetz Chaim says ha'avonim. The ha'achrayim kasvu, the achrayim write, the nuscha ha'amitis, that the proper and true text over here is hu hara'afim. It's not avonim, it should say ein malabnin es hara'afim. And ra'afim are tiles that we spoke about already previously. These are some sort of tile that were commonly used on roofs. I imagine something like a clay Spanish tile. And the Chavetz Chaim continues, he says, V'hu levenim, these are bricks or tiles, shemechasin bahem hagag, that were commonly used to cover a roof. That's what the Mechaber means when the Mechaber says that you're not allowed to heat something in order to use it as a roasting surface. He's not speaking about stones, he's speaking about these kinds of tiles. Aval avonim, but stones themselves, muter lelabein. It would be permissible to heat up stones until the point that they glow with heat, because there is no such thing as strengthening a stone through heating it. You don't make stones stronger by heating them, but you do make these roof tiles stronger by heating them, and that's why the Mechaber says over here that you cannot heat them. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Beis, you strengthen them, pirish. Shebelibun zeh, through this libun, through heating up these tiles to the point where they glow with heat, hey mischaskim, they become stronger. Vehevilei kemisakin moneh, and therefore heating them up would be the malacha of tikkun moneh. Now the Chavetz Chaim points out, from the fact that the Mechaber does not differentiate between new tiles and old tiles, Shmamina, it's implied from this svirale that the Mechaber holds, ta'afilu b'yeshanim aser, that it's even aser to be malabein old roof tiles. This is not a halacha that applies specifically to new ones, it applies even to old ones. Mipnei shebishar shemalabnan, because at the time when you heat them up, even if they're old tiles, mischazkin yoser, they become even stronger than they were before. So this is different than, let's say, what we spoke about a tanur. We spoke about a tanur and a kirayim. We said that sometimes to fire those up the first time, that could be an act of strengthening them. But that only applies to the first time. It doesn't apply to the second time. Over here by the roof tiles, it applies every single time. Every single time you fire them up and get them glowing hot, it strengthens them. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. There are those paiskim who hold the dafka b'chadoshim shetzrichon lechizuk, that it's only by brand new roof tiles where firing them up in order to strengthen them is a required step in their manufacturing process, that's when it's also avaloi b'yeshanim, but not by old ones. So he brings this down. If you look in the Shar HaTzion, he brings this down from the Eliyah Rabbah. However, the Chavetz Chaim is saying that it's clear that the Mechaber did not hold that way, because you don't find the Mechaber differentiating between new ones and old ones. Okay, continues the Mechaber, right, by the Ois Gimel from the Mishnah Berurah. Ve'ein shoivrin es hacheres, nor are you allowed to break off a shard of pottery. Ve'ein choitchin es haniyar, nor are you permitted to cut a piece of paper, litzleis aleihem, in order to use them to roast something on. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Gimel, ve'ein shoivrin, shekeshet solim dogim al ha'askala. Sometimes they would want to roast a fish on a grate, on some kind of a grill. Shoivrin cheres, they were accustomed to breaking off a shard of pottery, ay choitchin niyar, or they would cut a small piece of paper of some type, v'shoivrin oisai b'mayim, and they would soak this piece of pottery or this piece of paper in water, v'soidran al gabe askala, and then they would use that as a grilling surface. They would put that down on the grate, shalo yisaref hadag. So think about this, the way we use parchment paper. Sometimes you want to roast something on let's say a cookie sheet. You want to put something in the oven and you want to roast it, and you don't want it to stick to the sheet. So you take a piece of parchment paper and you put a piece of parchment paper on it. That's what they would do over here. Either they would use a broken piece of pottery as a surface to put the fish on, or they would cut a piece of paper and they would use that as a surface to put the fish on top of the grilling grate. And you're not allowed to do that. Well, Yom Tov also explains the Chavetz Chaim that it's also to do this on Yom Tov mishon tikun moneh, because by breaking that piece of pottery and creating this little piece of pottery that you're going to use for like a roasting pan, or by cutting a piece of paper and being miyached for something that you're going to roast on, that is tikkun moneh. You're creating a keli over here. You're creating something that's usable for the purpose that you need it for. That's an isser of tikkun moneh. I seem to remember, let me just take a quick look. I think there was an interesting Dirshu footnote over here. Sorry, I wasn't prepared right away with it. Let me just struck my memory. 1 second. Yeah, so in footnote number 2, we find over here there's a machlokes rishonim. This isser that we're speaking about over here, of tearing a piece of paper to use it like parchment paper to roast on, right here in the Dirshu footnote number 2, this prohibition of cutting the piece of paper, Kasav b'bir halacha le'el, the Bir Halacha wrote earlier in Siman Shin Mem, Shaladas HaRambam Eino Yelo Midrabanan. According to the Rambam, this is an Issa Derabanan, Mishum Shenire Kimisakin Kli. It looks like you're making a keli. I remember what made me research this is it's a little funny. By ripping a piece of paper that's tikkun moneh, you're making a keli. Is the piece of paper a keli? So according to the Rambam, it's an Issa Derabanan of nire kimisakin keli. Ve'eni surei midaraisa. Kevin she'eina niyar nasa keli gomer al yedei chituchai. The niyar of the paper doesn't actually become a keli by virtue of the fact that you ripped it off to use it to roast a little fish on. That doesn't make it really a keli, but it's a nireh kemisakin keli. V'hoisef, however, the Bir Halacha over there does write, Shaladas Rashi, according to the Shita of Rashi, Yitachen she'isurai midaraisa. It sounds like the Isser would actually be an Isser da'araisa, according to Rashi. The footnote here continues, Umashma, and it is implied, Sha'afilu tikun she'enai nasa el l'tzeres shimush chad pa'ami, even a tikkun moneh that you're doing for something disposable. In other words, you're creating this piece of paper, you're ripping off a piece of paper that you're going to use to roast a fish on. Certainly, that's only a one-time use item. You're not creating a keli that you're then going to put away and use again and again and again. It's something that you're going to use once and then dispose of. Yet we see from this that so umashmash afilu tikun she'eino nasa el l'ser shimush chad pa'ami kechituch niyar litzlais alav, something that you're only going to use once, like this paper that you're cutting to roast on, aser is still aser as tikun maneh. Amnam, however, we find another case that's similar, that's not that way. Legabe regel shenishbeta misafsal. What happens if you have the leg of a chair or of a bench that fell out? Kasav le'el, in Siman Shin Ches we learned, shemuter lahachnisa lemekayma, you're allowed to stick it back into its place, kishedarka lihiyay sham berifyain, if it's only going to be in there in a weak way. Not that you're putting it in a strong way so that it should remain there. You're putting it back in its hole, but it's only temporary. Even though, why don't you say it's tikkun maneh? You're repairing the chair. Now the chair works fine. He differentiates between our case of ripping the piece of paper to roast a fish on and sticking the leg back in the chair. He says, since the leg of the chair was already attached to the chair, you're not making a chair. The leg was already part of the chair. The chair was already finished. The leg fell off. You could stick the leg back in and it will stay there temporarily. That's not called tikkun maneh. But when you rip off a piece of paper to create a roasting surface and you designate it as something to roast a fish on, that is considered tikkun maneh, because you have something now that you didn't have before. You didn't have something, a type of keli to roast a fish on. Now that you ripped off a piece of paper, you do. So that's more of a tikkun maneh. He also brings down over here, how about the isser of kaireya, the isser of ripping? So he says over here, further in the footnote, that this ripping of the paper to roast on is not a question of the isser of kaireya. He brings down from the Bir Halacha, also in Hilchos Shabbos, because you're not fixing both pieces that you rip. In other words, you rip off a small piece of paper off a larger piece of paper, you're not making any improvement to the remaining larger piece of paper that you ripped the small one off of. You're only using the small piece. And he says, since you're not being misak in both pieces, that does not constitute kaireya. He does bring down, however, that if you would be makbid to tear the piece of paper to a specific size, that would be the isser of mechatek. Okay. Now let's go weiter. Weiter in the Mechaber. The Mechaber says, Ve'ein poitzin es hakone. You're not allowed to split a reed. La'asaisai k'may shpud, to create a shpud, a spit, litzleis by, to roast something on. Says the Mishnah Berurah cotton dalet is hakana la'asaisai. V'huadin, likewise, the ein poitzin oisai lachatzayin, you can't split a reed in half, l'sitay tachas hadag ala askala, to use part of the reed as a surface to roast the fish on. The chol midi da'avid lehistamish ba, you have a tikkun kli, because that would be just like ripping the piece of paper to roast on. That's considered tikkun kli. It's considered you're creating a keli for your use, and that would be awesome. Okay, Siv Beis, says the Mechaber, Poitzim egoizim b'matlis. You're allowed to take a bunch of nuts and wrap them up in a shmata and then bang on the shmata in order to crack open the nuts. Why not? So says the Mechaber, V'loi chayshinan shema tikara. And we don't have to worry that maybe by doing this, the sharp pieces of the nutshells will tear the matlis, will tear the shmata. Okay, says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in hay. Matlis, you're going to wrap up these nuts in a shmata, umake ala matlis, and then you're going to bang on the shmata, kidei lishbar harbe egoizim mebasachas. And the reason you're doing this is to break open a lot of nuts in one shot. Ois cut in vav, v'loi chayshinan shema tikara. And we don't have to be concerned that maybe the broken nutshells will tear the shmata. And the Mishnah Berurah explains why we don't have to worry about this. Because even if it would happen that the matlas would get torn, we don't care. That's not a problem. Because, now the Mishnah Berurah gives two reasons. One reason he says is that this is not a problem. The only time you have an isser of kaireya, of tearing, is when you're tearing something in order to repair it. Where does this isser come from, this isser of kaireya? We learn out that kaireya is a malacha that's asur on Shabbos and Yom Tov. We learn it out from the Mishkan, because in the Mishkan, when one of the yeriyos, when one of the tapestries of the Mishkan, either the roof coverings or maybe one of the curtains that were inside in the front of the Mishkan or the paraychis in the middle of the Mishkan, if any one of the tapestries got a rip, got a hole in it, what they would do is they would tear out an evenly spaced piece, and then they would make a seam and they would sew it together. So that's kaireya, that's ripping al menas litvar. With the plan, you're ripping in order to sew. That's when you have an isser of kaireya. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here, when you break nuts in a matlis, in a shmata, in order to crack the nuts open, if the matlis is going to tear, that's not kaireya al manas litvar. You didn't tear it in order to rip it, in order to sew it. So Rashi, he brings this down from Rashi, this reason. So Rashi says, therefore, we don't care if the matlis is going to get torn. It's not a problem. It's not karei al manas litvar. Now, the Gilyon Hashas in the Gemara in Beah, I think this is on Lamed Beis Amud Aleph, where Rashi says this reason, where Rashi says you're allowed to break the nuts in the matlis because even if it rips, it's not karei al manas litvar. The Gilyon Hashas asks, so what? The fact that it's not karei al manas litvar only makes that it's not an issa daraisa, but it's still an issa darabanan. Gilyon Hashas doesn't answer the question. But in any case, over here, the Mishnah Berurah brings down another reason why we don't have to worry about this and we're allowed to break the nuts in the matlis. And he says, V'gam hu davar she'enoi miskaven. This is a davar she'enoi miskaven. You have no intent to rip the matlis. When you wrap up the nuts and you bang on the matlis, you have no intent to rip the matlis. That's not what you're trying to do. And it's not a psik reisha that is definitely going to happen. And therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, this is mutter. Okay, so that concludes Siman Tov Kuf Ches. Now let's start off Siman Tov Kuf Tes. Kama dinim pratiyim lehilchas Yom Tov, many assorted miscellaneous halachas that pertain to Yom Tov. Uboy zayin seifim, and here we have 7 seifim. Says the Mechaber, shpud shedirtzaf. If you have a shpud, you have a roasting spit, and it got bent, it got twisted. Even though you're able to bend it back into shape by hand, and you don't need any specialized tools or anything else, the Mechaber says you're not allowed to fix it on Yom Tov. Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah over here. So if you notice, before we even get to Eif Katan Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah has a preface. He has a hakdama to this siman. So let's read through this hakdama. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Hinei kaidem shenaschil levaraseh siman. Before I begin to explain and be mefaresh this siman of Shulchan Aruch to you, akdem hakdama kitzara. I will first give you a short, concise hakdama. And in this hakdama, the Chavetz Chaim is going to lay out some of the basic rules of malacha on Yom Tov, what's mutter and what's aser. The hakdama is as follows. The machshirei ochel nefesh. When it comes to preparatory steps for ochel nefesh, we know that mutter malacha that's necessary litzarich ochel nefesh is mutter on Yom Tov. You're allowed to make a fire on Yom Tov in order to bake or in order to cook. That's tzarich ochel nefesh. But machshirei ochel nefesh, things that are only preparatory for ochel nefesh. For instance, sharpening a knife. That's machshirei ochel nefesh. Things that are machshirei ochel nefesh, those are machlokes. The machshirei ochel nefesh pligi b'gemara Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan. When it comes to the halacha that governs machshirei ochel nefesh, We have a machlokes in the Gemara between the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda and the Shita of the Chachamim. The Rabbanon Savri, the Chachamim hold midiksiv, since it says in the pasuk, Ach asher yeyachel l'chol nefesh hu levada yeyasa lachem. Only those things that are required for ochel nefesh, those things alone, yeyasa lachem, are mutter for you to do on Yom Tov. We learn out from there, what are you allowed to do on Yom Tov? Malacha that's tzarich ochel nefesh. Only things that are directly requirements for ochel nefesh. Who? V'lo machshirin. Those things you're allowed to do on Yom Tov, but not machshirei ochel nefesh. Preparatory steps for ochel nefesh, those you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. That's the sheet of the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Rabbi Yehuda on the other hand holds, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that the pasuk is coming to exclude some machshirei ochel nefesh. According to Rabbi Yehuda, what the pasuk is telling you is, tzarich ochel nefesh you're allowed to do. There are some machshirei ochel nefesh. There are certain types of preparatory steps for ochel nefesh that you're not allowed to do. Some you are allowed to do, some you're not allowed to do. What aren't you allowed to do? Rabbi Yehuda, oops, I skipped. For Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda holds that this exclusion from the pasuk pertains only rak al machshirin she'efshar la'asayson miba'odyod. What machshirei ochel nefesh does the pasuk come to exclude and say that it's not mutter on Yom Tov? Only those preparatory steps that you could not, that you were able to do on Erev Yom Tov. If it's a preparatory step that you could have done on Erev Yom Tov, then the pasuk is telling you it's not mutter on Yom Tov. You should have done it on Erev Yom Tov. Avalim iefsher, but if it's something that you could not possibly have done before Yom Tov, shari, then it's mutter even on Yom Tov. K'may ochel nefesh atzman, just the same as a malacha that's mamish a tzarech ochel nefesh. Upasku roiva paskim k'Rabbi Yehuda, and the Chavetz Chaim says most paskim paskin like the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. So again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you have a pasuk. Only things that you need for tzarech ochel nefesh, those are the only things that are mutter to do on Yom Tov. Tzarech ochel nefesh, but not machshirei ochel nefesh. But which machshirei ochel nefesh? Machshirei ochel nefesh that you could have accomplished before Yom Tov. That the pasuk is telling you you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. But machshirei ochel nefesh that you couldn't possibly do on Erev Yom Tov, that's mutter on Yom Tov the same way tzarech ochel nefesh is mutter on Yom Tov. That's the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. Va'afal pikein, however, the Mishnah Berurah says, Va'afal pikein, even though that's the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda and Roiv of the Paiskim Paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, still in all, Va'afal pikein, Lasois kli l'tzarech ochel nefesh, to mamish make a keli on Yom Tov, l'tzarech ochel nefesh, gan Rabbi Yehuda ma'ida aser. Even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that that's forbidden. So even Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that machshirei ochel nefesh that you could not have done before Yom Tov is mutter on Yom Tov. So how about making a pot? Are you allowed to make a pot? That's a preparatory step for ochel nefesh. And if I just found out, if I didn't even know that I had to cook yesterday, I thought I was going to eat out. Just today on Yom Tov, I found out that I'm not eating out. The virus broke out where I was supposed to go, or the virus broke out, chas v'sholom, in this guy's house, and he has to quarantine. So now, suddenly he found out he has to cook for Yom Tov. So he wants to go make a pot. According to Rabbi Yehuda, why not? It's machshirei ochel nefesh. It's ef shalasis b'erev Yom Tov. He couldn't have done it b'erev Yom Tov. He had no idea that he was going to need it. He only found out now that he was going to need it. So is he allowed to do that? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda, making an actual keli, that's aser. V'loi pligi, and Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim only argue, they don't argue ki im b'tikunei akli shu l'tzarech ochel nefesh. They only argue when it comes to being misakei a kli, like to fix or repair an already existent keli. To make a new keli, even Rabbi Yehuda holds that that's aser. But when it comes to tikkun kli, to fixing a kli, over there, Rabbi Yehuda holds that that's makshirei ochel nefesh, that's mutter on Yom Tov if it was ef shel asais miba'od yod. Tell Rabbi Yehuda, shari ef shel asais miba'od yod. According to Rabbi Yehuda, this is mutter if you couldn't do it from Erev Yom Tov. Kigayin, for example, shenes kalkal b'Yom Tov. You had a keli that got ruined on Yom Tov, so you couldn't fix it before Yom Tov. It was fine before Yom Tov. It broke on Yom Tov. So now you want to fix it. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that's makshirei ochel nefesh. That was ef shel asais miba'od yom, and you're allowed to do it on Yom Tov. Or maybe he could have done it on an Erev Yom Tov theoretically, but there wasn't enough time. Certainly, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if somebody had no idea that a keli broke before Yom Tov, he only found out on Yom Tov, and he needs it for ochel nefesh. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's makshirei ochel nefesh. That was ef shel asais miba'od yom, because he didn't even know it was necessary. But if he had time to fix it before Yom Tov, even though he forgot afterwards, that everybody would agree is also min HaTorah. And furthermore, you should know that even those paiskim, the paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, that's only in the context of doing malacha for yourself. They paskin like Rabbi Yehuda that if you have makshirei ochel nefesh that was ef shel asais miba'od yom, you could go ahead and paskin like Rabbi Yehuda and say, I'm going to do it now. Mishum de'meikar halacha mutter. Aval yesh dvarim, the Chavetz Chaim says there are things she'ein moirin kein la'acherim, where we don't paskin this way for others, shelo yavoyu lahakel yoser, so that she should not come to be makel even more, as we're going to explain weiter. Okay, we're going to stop over here, and Mir Hashem tomorrow we'll do the Mishnah Berurah on Sif Aleph and go weiter. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Berurah should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa to all those in need, and no one should know from any more tzar. Be well.